Okay, and you could probably tell me now what's not normal on this picture. Is we have our two bypass grafts there. Used to be they would take veins and use them to make these grafts. They would take the saphenous vein out of the leg, but veins aren't as strong as arteries, and they've gotten so good at doing these bypasses that patients tend to live quite a bit longer. And so now they're starting to use arteries to do the grafts, and you have to be more clever about where you get your artery, okay? Because we tend to need our arteries more than we need our veins. And but I'll show you a couple that they tend to use. Well, one of them that they'll use a mammary artery because it's really close to the heart. And they can hardly, they can just open the chest and just go over and take your mammary artery. Or your ulnar artery out of your arm, but we'll talk about that tonight. Okay, so the pericardium is a membrane that goes around the heart. It's a scenario we often see. It's sort of double membrane. Half of the membrane adheres to the organ itself, and then it comes back around, and you have the outer membrane, which secretes it's a serous membrane that secretes a lubricating fluid, and the heart would literally beat the heck out of the adjacent organs if it weren't for this pericardium that contains the lubricating fluid. So, okay, and the pericardium really only shows up on cadavers, but I've got a couple of great cadaver pictures to show it. We have really what just boils down to a really powerful muscular structure, okay? And all this muscle can do is contract, and the business end of this structure is the valves, and we have two sets of valves. This valve and this valve here sort of work together, and then we have this valve and that valve there, and we'll talk at some length about how these valves work. You may notice structurally that they're somewhat different just by looking at them there. We have 4 chambers in the heart. The chambers up above are receiving chambers, and they have rather thin walls. They are called atria, which is plural for atrium, and they are receiving chambers. Okay? The real pumps are the ventricles. Notice that they have much thicker walls because the pressure in them is much higher because they are pumping. Okay, but the blood is coming in constantly from all over the body, so we must have receiving chambers, which is a place for the blood to come while the pumps are pumping, because the pumps can't be receiving blood all the time, because about half the time they're busy pumping. Okay. We have one-way valves, which is typical of any pumping system, and the purpose of the one-way valves is always to keep the fluid from going back where it just came from. You want it to go somewhere else, otherwise you wouldn't have a very efficient pump, would you? So you want the fluid to be forced to go somewhere else. And so, for instance, let's just look at this system here. Veins are generally shown in blue. These are the vena cava veins, the superior and inferior vena cava, the largest veins in the body. Veins bring blood back to the heart from various parts of the body. So blood is constantly coming in via these vena cava veins into the right atrium. Okay? And notice that the cusps of this valve, the cusps are pointing downward, so that when this pumping chamber contracts, it's going to force the blood is falling into this ventricle from the right atrium into the right ventricle. And as we look at the heart, this is the right side of the heart. So the blood is coming back from all parts of the body under very low pressure, falling into the right ventricle. And when the right ventricle contracts, it pushes the cusps of the valve shut so that the blood can't go back where it just came from. It's got to go somewhere else. And the only other place it can go is up here in the pulmonary trunk. And notice the cusps of this valve, the pulmonary semilunar valve, the cusps are pointing upwards instead of downwards. And when the heart is relaxed, the cusps of the semilunar valves are shut. Okay? When the heart pumps, when it contracts, because the cusps are pointing upward, the blood is forced out through the cusps are forced open, and the blood is forced out into the major arteries. Okay? And this is the pulmonary trunk, which is a major artery which goes to the lungs, which are just right here. Okay? And this is, over here we have the mitral valve, and blood is coming back from the lungs. And notice that this half is shown in red because the blood is oxygenated, because it just came from the lungs. The blood is falling in here into the left ventricle, and when the left ventricle contracts, it forces blood out through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta, which is the largest artery in the body. And so all this very simple muscle can do is contract. And so both sides of the pump are doing the same thing at the same time. So both sides are contracting at the same time. When the right side contracts, it forces blood to the lungs. When the left side contracts, it forces blood out to the entire body via the largest artery in the body, the aorta. Notice that the aorta goes up and around and back down here, but some major arteries branch off of it up superiorly. Okay? So blood is constantly coming into the two atria. It's coming from all over the body over here, coming from the lungs over here. So the blood from all over the body falls into the right ventricle, gets pumped to the lungs, comes back from the lungs via the pulmonary veins, and falls into the left ventricle and gets pumped out to the entire body. Both sides are doing the same thing at the same time. The heart makes this characteristic lubbed up, lubbed up, lubbed up sound, and the first sound is the closing of these two valves. This is called the tricuspid valve, and this is called the bicuspid or mitral valve. Okay? And the louder of the two sounds is made from these valves closing. These valves make a slightly louder sound because they're of heavier construction, because the pressures are larger that are developed, especially over here when this powerful ventricle contracts. So the ventricles contract and you get your first sound, and when the ventricles relax, the blood that was forced out into the arteries are elastic, okay? And so the blood that's forced out into the arteries expands them, and when the ventricles relax, the blood wants to come back into the heart because the walls of the arteries are squeezing on the blood. But the cusps of the semilunar valves are pointing up, and when the blood tries to come back, they snap shut and prevent the blood from going back into the heart where it just came from. So the two semilunar valves prevent the blood from going back into the heart, okay? And these are called atrioventricular valves because they're between the atria and the ventricles. They are the AV valves, and they snap shut when the heart contracts, and these two snap shut when the heart relaxes. And so imagine the heart going lubbed up, lubbed up, lubbed up like that. If you can imagine what's going on with the valves, you know, you can pretty much visualize what the heart's doing. Okay? The construction of these valves is very heavy, and they're reinforced with connective tissue structures called the chordae tendineae. And the purpose of the chordae tendineae, the pressures are so great, especially over here, because this is pumping out to the entire body. The pressures are so great, they would tend to invert the cusps of the valve, and that would be instant death. Okay, so we don't want to invert the cusps of the valve. And so when the heart contracts, it pulls, these papillary muscles contract as well, pulling down on the chordae tendineae, which pulls down on the cusps, puts tension on the cusps of the valves and prevents them from inverting. And so that's why the AV valves have chordae tendineae in them. These valves, the semilunar valves, are of lighter construction, and the pressures in the arteries, especially this one, is fairly large, but nothing like the one, this left ventricle. When it contracts, the pressure goes way up. And so you don't want this one in particular inverting. This one over here actually tends to leak a little bit. We don't want any leakage at all out of this one, or you'll have a major heart problem, okay? And a heart murmur is leakage in the mitral valves. Basically, you can hear the blood oozing through. The pressure's fairly low, pumping to the lungs, and there's a little bit of leakage in the tricuspid valve. It's considered to be normal. It's called regurgitation. So, okay, so that's a little bit about that. And you should, of course, you know me and my test questions. Which of the following best describes the order in which, you know, the heart chamber blood goes through the heart chambers? So you'll see one of those one of these times. So blood is coming back from all parts of the body into the right atrium, falls into the right ventricle. At the same time, blood is coming back from the lungs and falls into the left ventricle. The two ventricles contract, and that snaps the AV valve shut because their cusps are pointing downward. And that, since the cusps of the semilunar valves are closed when the heart is relaxed, so when the heart contracts, it forces them open and pumps blood out into the pulmonary arteries and the aorta. Okay. The pulmonary arteries are shown in blue. Normally arteries are shown in red. The pulmonary arteries are shown in blue because they carry deoxygenated blood that's coming back from all parts of the body. Normally veins are shown in blue, but the pulmonary veins are shown in red because they carry oxygenated blood, and they come back into the left ventricle after the rather short trip to the lungs. Okay, and here's a little picture of the chordae tendineae, and the heart, when the heart is at rest, the chordae cusps of the AV valves are held open by the chordae tendineae, and blood just falls in to the ventricles. Okay? And so you should be able to tell me that in this picture the heart is relaxed. Okay? And the semilunar valves are shut. They are forced shut by the pressure in the arteries, which stays up. The pressure in the arteries never drops below the hypothetical 80, 120 over 80, or whatever it is. So now the ventricles contract, and that snaps the AV valve shut. Put for an instant, there is no movement of blood in the heart as pressure builds. It takes just like a tenth of a second for the cusps of the semilunar valves to be forced open. And okay, so here's a little deal about the valve. And so, okay, so in this picture, is the heart relaxed or contracting?
Contracting.
It's relaxed because the blood is the semilunar valves are shut and the AV valves are open. Okay. So blood is even though we're not showing it, it's falling into the ventricles. So in this picture, is the heart contracting or relaxed? Contracting. Blood is being forced out into the arteries, forces the semilunar valves open. Blood from the left ventricle is pumped out to the entire body under very large pressure. Blood from the right ventricle is pumped under quite low pressure to the lungs. and the AV valves snap shut, and the semilunar valves open. Here's a top view. The top of the heart has been removed so that you can look down, a superior view looking down into the semilunar valves, and you can see that the cusps are pointing up, okay, of the semilunar valves. So there are two semilunar valves, the aortic semilunar valve and the pulmonary semilunar valve. Okay, here we're looking at all four valves. Okay, and this is the top view, and the top of the heart has been removed. The most anterior structure in the heart, out in the front, is the pulmonary trunk. And this is the pulmonary semilunar valve. This is the aortic semilunar valve. These are the two AV valves, which are much more sturdy construction. This is the tricuspid valve, and that is the bicuspid or mitral valve. Notice that this wall is much thicker over here because it pumps out to the entire body. Okay, the chordae tendineae, notice the diabolical spelling on that word. So, of course, I'd never ask you to spell it, would I? So, and it shows the papillary muscles are really part of the heart muscle. So when the heart muscle contracts, these papillary muscles pull down, putting tension on the chordae tendineae so that the AV valves don't invert. And when we do our heart dissection, you'll see those chordae tendineae. Here's a nice picture looking inside the ventricles at the papillary muscles and the chordae tendineae. Okay. A septum is a wall between two chambers, and we have a very profound septum here, the interventricular septum. Everybody always mentions the interatrial septum, but it's almost impossible to see on a picture or a model. And I'm not going to ask you interatrial septum. It's hard to even find it on anything, on a real heart. You can puzzle over your heart dissection and try and find the interatrial septum. Tell me when you think you find them. We'll all have a good look. So the two septum, one of which I am a bit skeptical about, but probably exists in some little place. But I will ask you interventricular septum. So if you cut the heart tissue open, the inside has these trabeculae carnae muscles, highly muscular. And there's the chordae tendineae, and real sturdy organ. It's just tougher than tough. Okay. Let's talk now about the coronary vessels, which are so important because of the pathology that is involved with them. And if there's any pathology of the occlusive type that tends to plug up coronary arteries, it has profound effects on heart tissue, which has about the highest oxygen demand of any tissue in the body. So heart muscle has a huge oxygen demand, and if you compromise the patency of these vessels, and if they become narrowed at all, it reduces their ability to feed the heart tissue, and that's not a good thing. You get all the symptoms that are involved that you hear about, the most common one being shortness of breath, but all kinds of odd pains. The thing about the pains is that lots of other things can give you similar pains, and it's really easy to imagine that you have them even when you don't. So some people do have real angina. So the arteries. The heart feeds itself first. When the blood goes out into the aorta, we have the two coronary arteries coming right off it right away. So the heart makes sure that it gets fed before anything else. We have the left coronary artery and the right coronary artery. The left coronary artery bifurcates almost immediately into two major arteries, the circumflex coronary artery, which goes around the back side, and the anterior interventricular artery, which is one of the major identifying, one of the first things that jumps out at you when you look at a heart is this vessel, this artery here. And these vessels run down these little furrows called sulci, which isn't surprising. Here we have the right coronary artery, which gives rise to the marginal branch, passes around the backside, and gives rise to the posterior interventricular artery on the backside of the heart. Okay. We've removed the pulmonary trunk, but the pulmonary trunk is just about the most anterior part of the heart. The atria have very thin walls and have a rather odd appearance. It's amazing that they almost don't leak. You'll see when you get your heart. Sometimes they cut these atria off, but we try and choose a company that leaves a lot for you. I used to get these. If you get them from a butcher, sometimes the butcher will cut the heart off about right there. All the good stuff is removed. There was a butcher up by Bandon that left most of it, and there was a butcher in Klamath Falls that left quite a lot. But so we get it from a company who leaves, hopefully, a whole lot for you to see up here. Okay, the veins aren't named so prodigiously, but they kind of follow the arteries to some degree, and of course carry blood back to, they empty into the right atrium, along with blood from all the rest of the body. So here's a great axial slice. We're looking at the ascending aorta. Okay, so this is spinal cord, this is the sternum. Ascending aorta, this is the pulmonary trunk. And so ascending aorta, pulmonary arteries, descending aorta. Why is the descending aorta smaller in diameter than the ascending aorta?
To increase the pressure.
Remember those three major vessels that are branching out. So you've lost a lot of blood as you come around the aortic arch to the downside. And so it's already smaller. And of course that blood from those three, I sometimes call it the aortic triad of those three arteries that is taking blood to the arms and the head. I mean, that's a lot of blood already. Okay, so here's a great sagittal series coming from the left, your left side, over to the right in about 1 centimeter increments. And so here, of course, we see the heart. We see why CPR works so well, because the heart's right up, this is the left ventricle, the major pumping chamber, is right up against the sternum. So if you put pressure on that sternum, you're pumping a little blood through the left ventricle there. So you see the dome-like appearance of the diaphragm as well there. And so we're moving to the right. So here we get over about 1 centimeter to the right, and the left ventricle is significantly larger. And what do you think these little things are? Papillary muscles that give rise to the chordae tendineae. Okay. And we still have a little bit of left ventricle. This is interventricular septum right here. And here we are starting to get into the left ventricle, and this is the pulmonary trunk, the most anterior structure, this huge vessel that carries blood to the lungs. Okay. So now we're getting into lots of pulmonary trunk and right atrium over here. And this would be right at the bifurcation of the pulmonary trunk, and you'd have a pulmonary artery coming out at you and going back. And it's practically impossible to get all 4 chambers in one slice, is the only reason why I show you this, but I won't ever ask you anything off it. Okay, so here we see pulmonary trunk, which is very anterior. And we have the ascending aorta and descending aorta. Really, it's not appropriate to ever say just aorta. You always say what part of it you're talking about. Okay, so you have the root of the aorta, the ascending aorta, the aortic arch, the descending aorta, the thoracic aorta, and the abdominal aorta. Okay. And so here is the left pulmonary artery and the right pulmonary artery there. And we're looking from the left ventricle. This is a shot. This may be an echocardiogram, I forget. I sat in on an echocardiography class, of which is doing ultrasound, real-time ultrasound on a beating heart. And you can actually see the mitral valve flapping, and a lot of times it has junk growing on it. You wonder how it could even work. But it seems to be most people have it. It just looks like a bunch of algae or something growing on the cusps. Left ventricular outflow tract, and this common valve vegetation that you see. I think this is an echocardiogram. Okay, the great vessels. And of course we have, and we're going to be learning lots of blood vessels tonight. You have the veins coming back to the heart. The branching pattern of the veins is pretty much symmetrical. Okay, and so you have the left subclavian vein and the right subclavian vein. The right internal jugular vein and the left internal jugular vein. The left brachiocephalic vein, the right brachiocephalic vein. And all of those merge onto the superior vena cava, which descends into the right atrium of the heart. So the veins are a little easier to learn because of the symmetry of their branching pattern. The arteries are not very symmetrical. It's hard to have symmetry when you have 3 branches coming off the aorta. Okay, so right away that kind of messes up your symmetry. The branch and the veins are always superficial to the arteries, which kind of helps protect the arteries. And so we have the first of the 3 vessels coming off the arch. We have the brachiocephalic trunk. Your text tends to call it, well, here they call it brachiocephalic trunk. I think this is Netter though. It's the more proper term, really. Brachiocephalic arteries, I mean, it's a great big artery is often called a trunk. It gives rise to the right common carotid artery and the right subclavian artery. Then you have the left common carotid artery, and the word common is important. It means it hasn't bifurcated yet, as it's going to. And then you have the left subclavian artery. Subclavian means it runs underneath the clavicle. And these subclavian arteries feed the arms. I mean, they're really important. All of those vessels are hugely strategic. Okay, so these are ones you'll be learning, the ones I just pointed to. So major arteries, brachiocephalic trunk, and we have ascending aorta, aortic arch, descending aorta, thoracic aorta, and abdominal aorta. Left common carotid artery, left subclavian artery. Okay, the major veins, the superior vena cava, and let's go down here. The right and left external jugular veins run just underneath your sternocleidomastoid muscle. Okay. Okay. The right and left subclavian veins come from out in the arm region. They're rather short before the name changes to axillary. I think once they cross the first rib, the name changes from subclavian to axillary. And since these are coming back to the heart, we talk about them anastomosing or confluencing. They're coming together. Since our arteries flow away from the heart, they are bifurcating. So the great vessels. The great vessels are present in an area between the lungs called the mediastinum. And there are lots of important stuff in the mediastinum. That's a word you hear a lot in medical imaging. It's a word I want you guys to know because you'll hear it out in the field a lot. Okay. So the aortic arch. So this is just above the heart. And you see the three arteries coming off the heart. We see, they call this, whoever named these things is really quite a novice, because you don't use the word right because there's only one of them. And I would call it brachiocephalic trunk, but you certainly don't call it right brachiocephalic artery because there's only one of them. There's the brachiocephalic trunk, period. Then here we have the left common carotid artery and the left subclavian artery. This is the right brachiocephalic vein. And you can see a little bit of the left brachiocephalic vein coming across to join it. Okay. And this is the trachea, which you tends to see in that region. So pectoralis major, I won't ask you muscles. Okay. I stuck a new version of the PowerPoint Lab, which you now will be able to get. It's called the Revised PowerPoint Lab 5, because I wanted you to see these great cadaver pictures I have. And here we see the apices of the lungs, and we see the trachea, and we see the brachiocephalic trunk, the left common carotid artery, and the left subclavian artery. We see the right brachiocephalic vein and the left brachiocephalic vein crossing to join it. So that's some good anatomy, but I left everything identified for you there so you can see all that. Don't worry about the muscles for sure. We're just mainly doing blood vessels now. This is the esophagus. Okay.